There we go. Thank you. I don't ever need a microphone, but today I might. Thank y'all very much for coming. What a wonderful, beautiful day in November for us to have this. This is the Hopkins County Genealogical Society. This is our annual cemetery walk. We are so glad to be here to present this. We've been doing this several years, and we always have a good turnout, and we always have these wonderful people that decide to come back and talk to us about their past and history. And we've got 7 wonderful characters today, so I hope you really enjoy it. Let me tell you a little bit about the background of the cemetery, and then we're going to divide y'all into 2 groups of around 20. We have 2, and one group's going to start one way and one group's going to start the other. I do want all y'all to be mindful. There is a service that the burial will be about 3 o'clock. There is only one of our presentations fairly near to the plot, so they're going to start with that one and then end with that one in the other tour, but we're just going to have to kind of be observant when that's going on. So I just wanted y'all to be aware. The tent's right over there, so they would probably be out here around 3 o'clock. Sulphur Springs City Cemetery has a long history. Obviously, as people settled here, there had to be a place to bury someone, but there's varying accounts of when this cemetery actually began. Sulphur Springs acquired its first post office in 1854. Y'all all know the story about how the post office was originally called Bright Star. As a historian, I always have to correct these people that say we were Bright Star and then we were Sulphur Springs. That is not correct. The town was always referred to as Sulphur Springs, but when we applied for our post office, there was a small community in Rusk County that had that name. So someone, and this part I don't know, someone came up, well, let's call the post office Bright Star. But all the historical documents, all the census, everything still says during that period, Sulphur Springs, Texas, post office Bright Star. But anyway, a man by the name of Dr. Owen S. Davis was a founder of our town, plotted all the land around the square, lived at the corner of, past Houston and Davis, a little south, where the Pratt home is, now the Edens home. But Dr. Houston came here, and his name is spelled Houston, but he didn't like a certain early Texas hero by the name of Sam, so he pronounced his name differently. Well, he came in and bought the land north of Dr. Davis, and because of that reason, they kind of had a rivalry that went on in the late 1800s. But Dr. Houston's family is whose land that we stand on right now. Consequently, would you think of the Sulphur Springs City Cemetery that the man referred to as the father of Sulphur Springs, which is Dr. Davis, would be buried in this cemetery? He is not, because he didn't give the land for this. Dr. Davis turned back around a little later, bought land north of Dr. Houston, and started the Oddfellow Cemetery in the 1880s, and that's where Dr. Davis is. But Dr. Houston is here in the city cemetery. Dr. Houston and Dr. Davis also rivaled over who would get the county seat. When Dr. Davis, or get the city, later the county seat, Dr. Davis won that battle, and Dr. Houston started referring to this part of his land as New California, because you know how important California was in those late 1840s when they discovered gold. That's why this street leading into the city cemetery is named California Street. And the only places that we have numbered streets, and there's only 2 left, is in Dr. Houston's 320 acres, and that's 7th Street and 9th Street. That was all part of his land plot. Much different from what Dr. Davis did closer to town. But anyway, there's varying accounts of who was first buried here. There was a funeral held that a man documented in 1860 that said when they buried his mother, there were several graves already here. And we have probably 4 to 8 graves that are marked that date from the 1850s. We even have one gravestone that says 1849. That's in the old part of the city cemetery. but I firmly believe that it's a child, and I know the family, and I know when they got here. I think that body was moved out here later when a later child died, and then they marked their grave properly. So I think for sure by around 1852 they started burial here. The actual deed to the first part of the cemetery is not until about 1868, when Dr. Houston decides he's going to go ahead and formally deed. At this time, he donated or they bought an acre of land that was the African American cemetery, which is now referred to as Melhaven. But those two, this cemetery and that cemetery, have had original beginnings, but in separate plots. But we're in the 1880s. This is also a misnomer, and what a lot of people are used to. They think about the city cemetery being run by the city government, and that is not the case with our city cemetery. There was a group of ladies in 1887 that formed the Ladies of the Cemetery Society, and they started managing the cemetery. And that same group, with some modifications, have been continuous since 1887. And Myra Wilson was the longtime president of the City Cemetery Society for nearly 50 years, and they built this funeral rest chapel and dedicated it in 1923. So we're getting very close to this being a 100-year-old structure, so that families from out of town could come here and have their services in the Myra Wilson Chapel. As with lots of things, when the funeral homes kind of took off and they started building their own chapel, this chapel kind of lost its purpose for a while, and it even became the maintenance shed for the cemetery. And those beautiful stained glass windows that you see in there, luckily, were covered and stayed in decent shape until the Ladies of the Cemetery Society in the 1980s decided to, 1980s, 100 years after they started, to bring this chapel back. And so the chapel is beautiful. If you have a moment, please walk in there, but it was so pretty today that I wanted us to be outside. So that's your short history. I don't want to take too much time because you've got 7 people to meet. So eight, that's right. We've got a mystery, don't we?
Lo, Columbia, with her banner blazing, welcome full unfurled, bids the nations robed in progress to the birth feast of the world. Our blessings, great the blessings of all lands beneath the sun, in the name of heaven's bounty, of God's welcome to each one. Righteous Father of all people, of whom all people here adore, bless the nations here assembled, grant them peace forever. Well, hello, how are y'all doing? My name is James Lynch. James Daniel, I hope y'all don't mind I took that black coat off. They buried me in that thing. I've been wanting to get out of it for years. I'm James Lynch, James D. Lynch. I was born in 1836. I was born in Mecklenburg, Virginia County. I grew up there. I went over to North Carolina, University of North Carolina. I got a degree over there. I got a job teaching in Columbus, Mississippi at the Franklin Academy there. I taught there about 3 years, I believe. And while I was at the Franklin Academy there, I met a girl by the name of Hetty Cochran. Now, Hetty was from a family, Clay County was the next county over. And she and I were married in 1861. And fall of 1861, I resigned from working in the academy there. I was teaching advanced Greek and Latin, but I resigned and I enlisted in the Confederate Army. I was very proud to fight for the South in the Confederate Army. I enlisted as a private, and I was wounded severely. It took me about a year to recover from my wounds. While I was recovering, I formed a cavalry company on my own under General Polk. I was elected captain of my cavalry company, and I fought in the battle of Chickamauga. If you know anything about it, that was a pretty big battle for us in the South. We sort of won that thing, but we lost a lot of people too. Right after that, I was wounded again. I was shot through the knee there, and at that battle, A little while after that, I was captured and held prisoner of war in Rome, Georgia. There was a bunch of us was held there in a warehouse, was held in an old warehouse, and I never will forget, we had an old fireplace and that thing was cold, and we couldn't all get up against that fireplace. But it was cold. They was waiting to put us on a train, what they was going to do, and send us up to Johnson's Island. That was off up of Lake Erie. Now, if you think that's a long way, but they'll rail you up there, and that was a bad prison camp. I knew probably I was going to die before I got up there, or they was going to kill me one, or if I got up there, I was going to die in that prison camp. So late one October night, 1863, me and a buddy, everybody had the guards had sort of gone to sleep, and we slipped out and we hid out for 2 or 3 days, and I escaped from being a prisoner of war. And finally made our way back down the Confederate Army. Well, I got home, and the war was over. I got home to Clay County, Mississippi, and like a lot of Southern families, we'd lost just about everything we had. Our finances were depleted. We didn't have anything, so we moved on. Hetty and I moved on a farm there that belonged to some of her folks. I farmed for a couple of years. I found out that I wasn't much of a farmer. I wouldn't cut out much to be a farmer, but we was doing okay. But I'd got a law degree and set up a law practice and was pretty successful at being a lawyer. Also, I was printing a paper during Reconstruction. I was very much a spokesman for the South. I spoke for the South every time I got a chance, and I was very much against Reconstruction. So I published a paper. My ears, I suffered a lot of stuff in the war, and my ears began failing me. I got to where I couldn't hear. So I had to give up being an attorney, and I had to give up my teaching because I couldn't hear. It was affecting that. So I turned my attention mostly to writing literature, to writing poetry, to writing prose. You know, y'all are pretty lucky here. Y'all have the media, televisions, and things like that. Back in the day, we didn't have anything like that, and people turned to poetry, and they read books and stuff. That was a big deal. And I thought, you know, I had a gift for that. I wrote several books. I wrote The Clock of Destiny. I wrote The Stars of Texas. I wrote The Heroes of the South. I wrote The Siege of the Alamo. I wrote The Benson Bar, Mississippi. And when I wrote The Benson Bar, Mississippi, Governor Ireland here in Texas, he was the governor then, and Judge Willie was a Supreme Court judge. They wrote me a letter and wanted me to come to Texas, and they wanted me to do similar work that I done in Mississippi on the Benson Bar of Texas about legislature and about different laws and things like that. So I'd never been west of the Mississippi River. So I got on a train and I came to Austin and stayed in a boarding house for a year. Left my family down in Mississippi, and I stayed in a boarding house for over a year, and I wrote The Benson Bar of Texas and finished up The Siege of the Alamo and Stars of Texas, and they wanted me to stay on, but I needed to get back from my family. I had to see my wife and family. Well, James Daniel Jr., he was my second oldest son. He'd come to Texas, and he was a clerk there in Austin. When I went back, my oldest son, Rufus, they went in business in Fort Worth. They'd gone in business. I went back to Mississippi. My two girls, Maud and Pauline, they were in college down there in Columbus. And my three youngest boys were still at home. Well, the next year or so, they had that Columbian Exposition. If y'all know what that was, it's the World's Fair. They had it in Chicago in 1893. And they had a little contest going, who could write the best salutation to be read. That's what I was reading when y'all came up. I wrote that thing. Well, we'd be here all afternoon if I read all of it to you, but there was 100 competitors, and I won that thing, and they read that at the World's Fair in 1893. They read that at the opening of the World's Fair. I got a lot of recognition and about that. In 1894, I told you my two sons were in Texas. Well, James Daniel, 27 years old, he took sick and he died. we took his body back, well, had it brought back to Mississippi, and he's buried in Greenwood Cemetery down there in Mississippi. I thought that's where we'd all be buried sometime, but you know, things don't happen like you think they're going to. But we took his body back, and he's buried down there in Greenwood Cemetery in Clay County, Mississippi. Well, Rufus, my oldest boy, he lived in Fort Worth. I told you they were in business in Fort Worth. He met a girl named Molly Patrick. Now, Molly Patrick was a daughter of E.W. Patrick and Ann McClendon Patrick. Fine family right here in Sulphur Springs, Texas. Then they got married in that same year in 1894, and they brought their business back to Sulphur Springs and opened a dry good business. They lived at 353 College Street. If you know anything about College Street, when you pass the Boomer Spur Railroad track if you're going east, right there on the left, the Ashcroft's on the land, and up the top of the hill, the Patrick's on the land. That's where they lived, on the Patrick land there. Well, we came up, my wife and I came up. Maud, one of my daughters, she was down in Mississippi. She married William Savage. Pauline married John Creighton. They were in Austin. Junius was in, he eventually went to Austin. Charles went to Austin. And we came to Texas to help Rufus with his business here. And I became ill, and I laid on my deathbed for several weeks, and I died in 1904. Hetty, my wife, she lived on 17 more years. She eventually went to Austin to live near my sons and daughter that were there, and she lived in a boarding house for Confederate widows. She fell and broke her hip. Because of that, she died, and they brought her back, and she's buried here. So that's sort of my story. That's my story. It's why I'm here. I was known throughout the South as an author, a poet. A little aftermath, I'll tell you. I told you about my son Rufus and Molly. They had a girl named Ruth. They had a boy named Virgil. They're buried over there. Ruth, when she was 1917, she was 22 years old. She met a man in Sulphur Springs. He was a little older than her, but she met a man by the name of Charles Franklin C.F. Ashcroft. Y'all have heard of Ashcroft. She married C.F. Ashcroft. Well, a couple of years later, they had a son born, B.F. Ashcroft. All of you know B.F. Ashcroft. That's my great-grandson. Well, in 1939, my granddaughter and C.F. Ashcroft built the big Ashcroft house there and made it their home. They lived in that home. In 1946, my granddaughter Ruth and C.F. Ashcroft, they was vacationing in Los Angeles, California. They owned, they was in a lot of things, the Coca-Cola company, Power and Light company, but they were vacationing in California. He suffered a heart attack and died. They brought him back, and he's buried over there with the Ashcrofts. And Molly lived on a few more in the Ashcroft house a little while longer, but eventually she married a man by the name of William Calhoun Sterling. Now, he was a brother to Carl and Earl Sterling. Earl was a doctor, and Carl was a druggist. Owned a business on the west side of the square, on the east side of the square in Sulphur Springs. And well, to tell you the truth, he was a half brother to them. That's another story we get into. But that's my. Then B.F. Ashcroft married Denny Pounds, you know that, and Denny Pounds, and they lived in that Ashcroft house that my granddaughter built. But I'm glad y'all came out. That's my story. That's my life story, and that's what I did, and I'm sticking to it. Thank y'all very much. Thank you.
Very interesting.
Well, I think most of you are probably close enough you can hear me by now. I am Minnie Vera Jeffrey Shepherd, and I am so glad for y'all to be here. And even though my neighbor right over that way, even though he's over there, it's still awfully quiet around here. And I don't have many people to get to talk to. Well, I was born in about 1883 at Carroll's Prairie. But I want you to know before I go on, I've heard this man's always telling about different post offices. Now, Carroll's Prairie, Ferdinand Carroll was my grandfather. And it was first called Carroll's Prairie, but it's down where you call Como now. Now, I want to get rid of one myth while y'all are here. Now, Como was called Carroll's Prairie, then it became Carrollton. Well, they kept getting mixed up between Carrollton, Texas, and Carrollton in Dallas County. So the post office, when they came in 1870, they used the name Bacchus. Well, that's the god of wine, and it was short. But when the railroad came through, they changed it to Como because it was short, and the person putting the railroad through, well, he had been to Italy and he thought Como was the prettiest place he had ever seen. So that's where it got its name. Well, as I was there, let me tell you a little bit about Como. Well, my great-grandfather, Ferdinand Carroll, came there in 1846. But on the way, his first wife died. So he came there with 8 children as a widower. 2 of those children died. But then later, he married my mother, Betty Carroll, which was the second child of his second wife. She had 4 children when they came into marriage. Now y'all are gonna meet my older sister in a few minutes, and I am so put out with her. I am so put out with her. How dare her come back at an age that's that young, and me, an old woman? Well, you just look the other way. Maybe she just aged better than I did. Lord, I got married. I went to school in Como. Then I came into Sulphur Springs and went to Holderness Women's College that was in the dorm where Eastville College was. Well, Eastville College burned in 1900, and in 1901 to 1903, it was a women's college. So I went to school and I was well educated. But I met a man from the country. Chester Charles Shepard was from Pine Forest, Texas. Now that's even further out in the sticks than Como. Well, we married. When we first married, we lived on Jefferson Street, and that's where my twin boys were born and died. Then we moved over on College Street to 414 College. Some of you may have noticed there's a big rock in the yard there. Well, now, they used to tell all sorts of tales about that rock. But the truth is, there was a Dr. Beckton that had his office out in Tarrant, and then when Tarrant began to die, he moved it into town, and he built that house. Well, Beckton Street runs beside the house, but they misspelled it. It's not the way the doctor spelled it. But that rock that's in the yard, he was a short man. It's the only way to get on his horse. So he climbed up on the rock, got on his horse, and went on his rounds. Well, as time went on, it wasn't just my 2 children. I had Vera and I had Charles. It wasn't just my 2 children. There was always someone. My sister moved in and out with her kids quite often. My nieces and nephews came and went. But, Lord, my nieces and nephews. We didn't have running water, we had an outhouse. So I papered the outhouse with funny papers from the Dallas Morning News. And I made sure they lined up just right. You know, they had to carry the story on. The story had to go. So they lined it up. And I want to read you a poem one of my relatives wrote. I have a preference for patterned paper. On my bathroom wall, I think it's Aunt Minnie's outdoor privy that from so long ago I recall. Outside it looked like all others I had seen, but inside it was different indeed. And I thought pretty keen, with brightly colored funny papers from the Dallas News. I'd say all the characters from the comic strips of the day marched to and fro to entertain, to amuse one so. As I sat entranced by it all, I almost forgot I had first come to call. I remember Happy Hooligan, he wore a funny hat, and Buster Brown with a certain haircut, a style that's with us yet. Then there was Mag and Jiggs in their daily round of spats. I last decorated in the bicentennial year, hence the scheme of red, white, and blue. There were red medallions and gold medallions, centered with bold green eagles. They are surrounded by a pattern of blue, all laid upon a background of white. It's time to do it again, you say, but I can't bring myself to change something that I have liked so well. It all had come together in a special way. J.W., my Negro, that I'll tell you more about in a minute, agreed to put the paper on. I never understand why he kept saying, "Oh, Jesus," as I stood over him telling him how. He did a great job of lining up the pattern just so, and not an easy job in an old house with crooked walls. The colors have not faded. All the towels I own make themselves right at home. Hues of color I have used and seen make it pleasingly all right. Reflecting all this color, there's a mirrored wall, and underfoot, a bright red carpet to welcome all. There's lots of cream and white to cool down those darker hues, the reds, the golds, and greens, and the blues. Aunt Minnie taught me many things of worth, not at the least of which is that when you answer nature's call, your surroundings don't have to be dull. So as you can tell, Aunt Minnie, as they called her, called me, as they had quite a time in her outhouse. While she was teaching her son music, there was a little colored boy that kept coming to listen. And I invited him to sit down at the piano. And he had picked up everything I'd tried to get my son to pick up. So I agreed to give him music lessons. You see, his grandmother had worked for my family for many years, and he came with who we called Aunt Annie to my house every time she would come. But you realize the reason I'm known in town is because of the cakes I made and decorated, and being such a history buff. I collected newspapers for years. Finally, I had them bound into 3 books that were so heavy they couldn't be picked up. Those have gone to Austin for them to archive. And also, I was president of the I gotta get it just right, president of the Forum of Federated Women's Clubs. Quite a mouthful. I thought Sulphur Springs should have its history down before the people alive forgot it. So I did an outline that I gave each of the women's clubs in Sulphur Springs, different part of history to write. It ended up being 7 books of Sulphur Springs history. And that's the reason I am still remembered. Because you pick up one of those books and you know where all of today's historians got their information. And I really appreciate you coming. Y'all come back sometime.
Class, I am Gladys Alexander. I was born on June the 20th of 1896 in the Bethel community right here in Hopkins County. My parents were Ben Witcher Alexander and Mary P. Formby Alexander. There were 5 girls and 1 boy. You know, I enjoyed growing up in Hopkins County. As a freshman, though, in school, I can remember winning a pie baking contest. But I don't think I've baked a pie since then. And in 1916, my sister Grace, she and I graduated in the old Opry House on 117 Jefferson Street. It was so big then, and now it seems a lot smaller. After graduation, I took the teacher's exam. Then you didn't have to have a degree. But I decided that I wanted my degree. So in the summers, I would go to North Texas State Teachers College there in Denton, Texas. And my first 2 teaching years were at Stouts Creek near Saltillo and Gafford's Chapel. They were rural schools here in Hopkins County. In 1918, I began teaching at Houston Elementary School. Oh my goodness, Houston Elementary School, I'll never forget that. That's where we started the May Fete. I don't know if you know what a May Fete is, but it was a lot of work, a lot of hard work. Lizzie Murray made most of our costumes. She would be in class sewing, and then she'd stop and say, okay, next reader, and then she'd go right back to sewing again. She made all of those costumes. And the costumes were beautiful. They were made out of white satin. And there was a big stage that was built outside of the school. There weren't any chairs. But you know what? The people did not mind standing up. They came, the whole town turned out for our May Fete. And the May Festival was wonderful. It continued to grow, and I remained a main supporter of the May Fete and the May Festival. That's what it was called. Sometimes when it was over, I thought I had lost my mind. And lost all my friends, too. But I became active in school plays. You know, I don't remember how many school plays I was in or how many that I helped with, but there were a lot. My early schoolyard duty was teaching baseball. Oh my goodness, I would even play some. I broke up, I don't know how many fights out on the baseball field. But, you know, there really wasn't discipline problems. You know, we had a lot of, you know, baseball disagreements, but it was never too many. And I loved the kids and I loved teaching. They were the nicest kids. I started the National Honor Society when I moved over to high school. They even named it after me, National Honor Society of Gladys Alexander. And while I was at the high school, I taught American history and social studies, and I taught for many, many years there. I was on the faculty at East Texas State University, where I received my master's degree. I was also a member of the First Baptist Church of Sulphur Springs, and I served as a superintendent to the junior department. I was a charter member of the Business and Professional Women's Club and Delta Kappa Gamma. I'll get it right in a minute. And I have had many honors in my lifetime, but one of the most memorable ones was when they named the street after me. And you can see my picture here, but one of the honors was cutting the ribbon there, and it signified 54 years of dedication to the youth in Sulphur Springs. Yes, I retired in 1961. I had taught 46 years full-time and almost 8 years part-time. You know, my sister Grace and I had a lovely home, and we had so many memories and beautiful plants. Oh, I enjoyed it very much. But you know, Miss Gladys died on March the 21st, 1986 at the age of 89 years. Isn't that wonderful? And as a retired teacher, I can tell you I broke up a few fights on the playground myself. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this little talk about Miss Gladys Alexander.
Well, I'd like to welcome you all here. Is that everybody? My name is Anne Lorraine Stribling Frost. I don't go by Anne, I go by Lorraine. I just thought it was a beautiful name and I used a Y in it. I like that. I was born in 1888 here in Hopkins County. My parents were Thomas Joseph Stribling and Sarah Ann Seal. We lived here all of my life, and I grew up here, went to school here. And during school, I met a gentleman in my school, a young man, that was, his name was William Claude Frost, but we all called him Claude. He was real popular, everybody liked him. And as we graduated out of school, he decided to move to Muskogee to take a job position there. And it was at a mercantile store for Spaulding and McAlvin Mercantile Company. They made him a manager of the store. Well, time was like getting between us, so I'd make trips up there and he'd make trips home, and I'd go stay at a boarding house and visit him, and went to the store, and I was asked if I would like a job there at that store. I was like, this is exciting. I'd like to have a store and work in it. So I worked in that store. We worked there about a year, a little over. And Claude came up to me one day and asked me to marry him. And I was like, yes, I will marry you. Well, we were real popular up there. Everybody just would come and visit us at the store, and they just loved us, and they would write really pretty things about us for our wedding and nuptials and stuff. But as you know, when you're visiting old cemeteries, you wonder what they did, wonder what they look like. I wanted people to know about me. So I was able to come up, luckily, with one surviving member of our family who is a great-granddaughter to me. And she's like, I got some pictures I can send you. Well, this was me back when I was young.
No wonder he asked you.
You want to pass it around? You can. Can you see that? Well, you hear me bragging about my husband and how good he done. He was a nice looking gentleman. This was Claude. So about a year we was working real hard up there at Spaulding and McAlvin's. And it was time to surprise everybody. We're having a family. And this is our little girl. I named her Lorraine Ann versus mine being Anne Lorraine, but spelled her Lorraine different. So after about a year, she was born in Muskogee. After about a year, we moved back to Sulphur Springs. And Claude said, I want to open up our own store. That was wonderful to me. Well, we did. We opened up Claude Frost and Company. And this building actually stood down where the City National Bank is now. It stood next to it. Down on the square. I think it was, I can't remember the address right offhand. It's been so long. But anyway, I also wanted to show you, I had a lovely friend that saved back some pictures of my house that I lived in when I passed away here. And it was right down here at 428 North Davis. And I wanted to show you what the house looked like. It's not there now. It had beautiful azaleas out front. It's a beautiful place to me. That was home. Now it became an empty lot. Well, Gene Bell here locally bought the place. Later it became an empty lot. And now you'll notice a brand new home there. That this was the other side of the house. But there is new owner there now, Janet Watson, who just built a new home. That's in the place where this home was at. So when we started our business down here, I had thought I'm going to go up and talk to the paper, talk to R.W. Fanning, and see about putting some ads in the paper for our store. And he did. He made us up ads to go in the newspaper about our store. Business just started booming for the dry goods store. We were just getting customers all the time. Well, we decided a couple of years later to go in and revamp, kind of rearrange, rebuild. We wanted more room, more light. And upstairs we wanted to fix it where family and friends come to visit. We had a place to entertain, for them to stay before their trip back home and rest. So that's what we did. Well, in the meantime, there was a store called Trammell Store. And I went to work at the Trammell Store doing some of their millinery stuff over there. And I got to thinking, I'm really liking this. And our town needs more of this stuff. So I started researching and I was studying, and I went and talked to Claude and I said, I want to start my own millinery store. He said, fantastic. She said, I think I'll have this part of the store. So she chose that part of the store to open up the millinery, or I did. So anyway, I thought the only place I could go get name brand hats, you know, that are in style, that is what every lady wants, and gloves and jewelry and brooches and stuff, I needed to go to the main places where these name brand companies were at. They were in St. Louis and in Chicago. So I would travel up there. Claude was like excited when I come home with all this load of hats. I only bought 200, you know, but we were going to have a big sale that weekend. They were going to be $3 a piece. And so I'm sure when you're out going around visiting today, you'll see a couple of my customers that used to love to come to my store. Callie Jeffries Fanning and Vera Mae Shepherd. They loved my hats. Callie may be wearing one of my hats today. But anyway, I thought Clyde had an ad in the paper. I needed an ad in the paper too. So I had an ad put in the paper. Now the fun thing about this is you get to see all this kind of stuff on the portal to Texas history. And reading old newspapers, you get to see all the ads from our store, stories about us. This was another ad. But I just thought it was an up-to-date ad back then. It was really pretty. Anyway, our store was doing really, really good. And I thought I still have some time to go to thank you. I still have some time to go to join a ladies club. So I went to the Business Professional Women's Club, joined them. That was a great place because you could see what everybody wanted, hear what they wanted, learn from them. Well, Claude started getting sick, and we decided that we would go to the doctor, and sadly he had diabetes, and you know what that tolls on you. So we lost him at an early age through several dilemmas that he had with diabetes and having to have legs removed and stuff. So he died in 1926. I stayed on working the store and keeping up the millinery store because it was just going good. And probably another 35 or 45 years, 40 maybe. But anyway, I ended up dying when I was 81 years old. And people laugh sometimes because they're like, she died April the 1st. It was April Fool's. Guess what? I'm not dead. I'm still here. I'm talking to y'all. But anyway, one of the ladies asked me, do you have any original hats? I said, yes, I do. This was one of my favorites. And it was an original. Isn't that peacock blue color pretty? I'll leave it in the box because I don't want it to get wind blown. The one on the front, the white one there, with all the beadwork, that's an original. Has a tag in the front of it. The black one in the front with the feathers, that's an original. You know, you always open up boxes and find more hats. And Fascinators. I like the Fascinators. So I just have all colors of them. You can just wear them in whatever color you want. And then this is an original too. Still has one of my little price tags hanging on it. But we loved it here in Sulphur Springs. And we were glad for all the business that we had. And I'm so excited that y'all came by to see me today. And come back and visit us again. Thank you.
Well, I am so glad to see all my Hopkins County friends here today. I know some of you were probably advertisers in my husband's newspaper, the Sulphur Springs Gazette. And I want to extend a special invitation and my gratitude that my family is here. This is my grandson, Bill Jeffries, and his wife and grandchild. And I found there's another Fanning in our midst, so this is just a great gathering. I'm so glad you've all traveled this far. Let me introduce myself. I was born Callie Elizabeth Jeffries in 1881 in Como, Texas. Back in my carefree days, I attended Eastman College and the Conservatory of Music and Art, which that was located then on the corner of California and Church Street here in Sulphur Springs. I recently found some pictures that you might enjoy. This one shows us smiling and riding in a horse-drawn carriage parade. And soon after that, guess who I met? The handsome William Fanning. Robert William Fanning.
Robert William Fanning, yes. Nice to see you again, Callie.
You too. It's been a long time.
Yes, yes. Glad to meet y'all. Callie here was my wife, and who are all these people anyhow?
Oh my goodness, these are your relatives and our friends in Sulphur Springs.
You know, I'm glad to see relatives here because on my marker here it says, to live in the hearts we leave is to not die. And so if I'm living in the hearts of my relatives, and I haven't died. But anyhow, Callie was my wife, and let me tell you, it was love at first sight. I saw her sitting on a bench there, and I thought, boy, that's one pretty girl, and I need to marry her, and I did. I'm from over in Mount Vernon. It's about a half day's ride east of here, and we got married, moved to Sulphur Springs, and we had 3 kids. There was Billy and Nellie and little Jimmy Frank. He was just a baby. I bought an interest in 2 newspapers here, the Hopkins County Echo and the Sulphur Springs Gazette. I was just working on an article on that today. But it was a tough business, but we were making it. I tried to be the best newspaper man I could. I tried to report the facts, all the facts, and I had a reputation for being an honest newspaper man, and people came to expect that from me, and so I tried to do what they expected and provide the honest truth of things. And sometimes that would get me in a little bit of trouble with people. Matter of fact, at the time of my death, I was working on a little expose of local politics, and somebody may have got wind of that, I don't know. The night of my death, November 6, 1916, now that would have been 105 years ago yesterday. And me and myself and some others, we were meeting upstairs and discussing things, and got around to politics, of course, and Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election. A lot of people weren't too happy with that income tax thing that got put through during his first term. They seemed to think it was some sort of a government tithe, and they weren't happy about that. And then there was Huddleston that got appointed to the Powerful Railroad Commission, and there was something pretty shady about that too. But anyhow, the night of November 6, 1916, I had to leave early for another engagement, and I got to the top of the stairs, and they say that I accidentally fell, but I really thought I got pushed. I don't know. Anyhow, I fell to the bottom of the stairs, and I don't remember too much after that, except that I died the next morning, and I've been here ever since. Now, you know, when we were meeting up there, we were actually meeting in Haskell Dickerson's office. He was a local landman, and County Attorney Farr was bringing some tax deeds over for him to look at, and he found me at the bottom of the stairs with a fractured skull. And like I said, I died the next morning, and it sure left Callie and the kids in a fix, and I think she went to live with her sister. Well, it's nice meeting y'all, but I really need to go. Let me check here. Yeah, it's kind of bright here on this side of the dirt anyhow. But I do want to tell you one more thing before I go. I was kind of excited when they started digging this hole here next to me, and I found out that Callie was going to be here beside me in the Sulphur Springs Cemetery. So good to have you here with me.
Too. Thank you. Like Robert said, my sister was so good to take us all in, and if y'all haven't met Minnie already, I'm sure you will see her in just a few minutes. Among other things, she will tell you that they had quite an amazing outhouse. I'm sure she'll tell you all about it. We frequently moved over the next 10 years, often moving to Jonesboro, Arkansas to live with my brother, and also to Jackson Parish, Louisiana. The Lord had blessed me with a talent to create beautiful things. I loved making quilts and paintings for my brothers and sisters and nieces and for my church. I understand that my grandchildren have looked for many years trying to locate these pieces. A few were in famous museums and churches. I'll tell you more about those later. But many were damaged because they had been stored in an abandoned house here where I had once lived. I wish I had actual quilts to show you, but alas, I just have pictures. This is one of my favorites, my Leading Ladies quilt. I quilted it as a tribute to the movie stars of the 1930s and 1940s. Some bear striking resemblance to my favorite stars, Vivian Leigh, Myrna Loy, Jean Harlow, and Olivia de Havilland. I used silk and lace and fabrics to craft this quilt, and the images were created with applique, stitchery, quilting, hand-painted details. You quilters out there know how difficult that can be. But this quilt is now on display in Morristown, New Jersey at the Morris Museum. Well, in 1926, after 10 years as a single mother, when I was 45 years old, I married G.P. Smith, a landowner from Sulphur Bluff. Some of his family is still around this area. During those next 12 years, I graduated from the Washington School of Art in St. Louis and created many quilts and art pieces. In 1939, the World's Fair was being held in New York City, so I submitted my storybook quilt. I was thrilled that my original child's quilt had won a prize. I'd also won in Dallas and Fort Worth fairs. Oh, by the way, this storybook quilt is now in Austin at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas. I also quilted the Ladies and Hats quilt, and you can see it at the University of Texas. Some of my quilts are owned by family, but there are many that have never been located. But now I want to tell you about my other passion, my painting. I loved working in every media. I did hundreds of watercolors, pen drawings, china plate art, landscapes, portraits, still life, sketches, religious art, and art copies. This is a picture of two of my religious oil paintings, and the top one is still showing in the Jonesboro United Methodist Church. Winning that prize gave me confidence to write a letter to the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. I've always admired her, so I created this picture frame quilt for her. Each frame depicts 12 moments in Eleanor's life, from her childhood up to her role as First Lady, and it is now on permanent display at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Museum in Hyde Park, New York. And this one, my niece, Victoria McConnell, found my fashionable ladies quilt in an old trunk. Maybe a truck too. It had deteriorated after so many years and was very stained. In 2012, Victoria donated it to the Briscoe Center for American History at University of Texas. They sent it to their preservationist, who tacked fine mesh over the images to save them. And bluebonnets. I love painting bluebonnets. My niece often accompanied me. I think that's how she became so interested in art and became an accomplished artist. My relatives have searched the country looking for my paints. They found many signed CFS that I painted while I was married to Mr. Smith. In 1938, we separated and he filed for divorce, claiming no financial responsibility for me due to my indebtedness on his 872-acre farm. So once again, at age 58, I was homeless. I prayed the Lord would provide for us, and he did. My sister Minnie and others once again made room for us. While we were in Chicago, there was great interest in my quilts and painting, but that never produced any buyers. On January 22nd, 1946, I died at my daughter's home in Hodge, Louisiana. I was brought back here so I could be buried next to my husband, Robert Fanning. Thank y'all for coming. I know there are others waiting to give you some exciting stories.
Welcome one and all. It's great to be up and out of the ground for a little while. I've been down there for about 125 years. And as your tour guide said, this is the older part of the cemetery. And my first wife, Rena Ann, right here, may be the oldest grave of a white person in the cemetery. In the 1920s, when the Wilson building was dedicated, the speaker said that Miss Rogers may have been the first to be buried here other than Indians in 1857. So if anybody finds a tombstone in here that's earlier than 1857, please let me know. I am Judge Frank Rogers. I was the judge here, first elected in 1860 here in Hopkins County. My family, my parents came from North Carolina to Tennessee, and I was born in the Nashville, Tennessee area. We lived there for 10 years. My father was a plantation owner, and he worked the land. We then moved to Topeka County, Mississippi, which is just a little north of Oxford and just a little north of Tupelo, if you know where that area is. So that was my formative years. I lived in that area around Ripley, Tennessee, as did the Faulkners in that area of the world. So I was there, and then in 1847, when I was just 20 years old, I became a Mason, joined the Masonic Lodge. 3 years later, I married my wife here, Rena Ann, in 1850. Her brother, and her maiden name was Weaver, her brother James Weaver, that lives a little down the hill from us here, he came to Hopkins County before we did and owned a great deal of land out at Martin Springs. We decided to move to Hopkins County, and we entered into business with my brother-in-law, James Weaver. Our mercantile business was right at the corner of Main and Gilmer, where the Edward Jones building is today. That's where our location was, just 3 years after Dr. Davis had platted the downtown square. So we had a prime location, and we had an excellent business there for over 20 years, my brother-in-law and I did. And for a time, the Bright Star Post Office was in our building. And I was a real strong Democrat. And you know, if you wanted to be the postmaster, then it was a political appointment. So it's very likely that I was the Bright Star postmaster. Shortly after I moved here, I decided that we needed a Masonic chapter here in Sulphur Springs. So we formed one, and the meetings were held above our store. And we named our Masonic chapter the Bright Star Masonic Lodge, and it was that for a number of years before it was changed to Sulphur Springs. So another Bright Star term that went in and out of my store. When we formed the Masonic Lodge here, of course, that was very important in early days, and some of the fellow initial members who elected me the Grand Master of our lodge initially, we had Bufords, we had Askews, we had a Mr. Tomlinson, kind of reads like some of the streets downtown, Mr. Conley, Mr. Van Sickle. These were all members of our initial lodge here in Sulphur Springs. Well, I said I was a good Democrat, and I got elected judge in 1860. And of course, this was probably the most important election in American history. And so one of the first things I did as county judge was I had to verify the election results. And so the presidential election of 1860 saw John C. Breckinridge, who had been the vice president of the United States. He was got the most votes in our county. He got 871 votes. John Bell out of Kentucky, Tennessee area, where he was real strong, he got a little over 200 votes. That Yankee Democrat, Stephen A. Douglas, he got 4 votes. That other guy that was running, he didn't get any votes in Hopkins County. But Lincoln won the national election. Then he called for 65,000 troops. So then Texas seceded, and most of the young men in Hopkins County decided to volunteer to join the war effort, and the fight against the Yankees. So as a judge, we raised $5,000, which was a lot of money in 1860, to supply our troops with uniforms and the basic necessities. And of course, the women would have helped sew the uniforms. We also sent, after they had departed, we sent more money down to Jefferson so that they could have basic things like coffee and sugar, and those got sent off to our troops that were fighting back east. So that was one of the, I did not serve in the Confederacy because I was home running the effort here. My brother-in-law, James Weaver, he was quite prominent in the Civil War and became a colonel and served his country well, came back, Colonel Weaver did. We continued our mercantile business. Eventually he and 2 of his son-in-laws formed a bank, which eventually evolved into the City National Bank. So he was quite well-to-do. I did a lot of other things here that made Sulphur Springs a better place to live. We formed the Central College, and I was president of Central College Board of Directors, which was kind of the main educational institution in our town. And we did that for 7 or 8 years, and I served as the president of that board. And we eventually turned it over to Mr. Eastman and Professor Eastman, and it became known as Eastman College. And that was out on what we know as College Street. I lived in the 300 block of College Street, so I could walk to town to my shop and to the do the work of the judge. Initially, the courthouse at one point was in the lower level of our new Masonic building that we built at the corner of Main and Depot Street. That's now called Oak Avenue. That's where the Professional Land and Title is now. So that's where the first Masonic Lodge was built. The building that stands now was built later on. But it served, as I said, the Masons were very important, and that building helped house our courthouse at one point. So it was very important. I was a devout Methodist. I was elected the superintendent of the Sunday schools, which I served for over 25 years. I went to national Methodist conferences in Kentucky and elsewhere. So I was a very prominent person in our county and helped to make it a better place. But just like everybody else, we all die, and in 1895 I gave up the ghost. And I've been laying here ever since, and I'm sure glad you all came by to visit. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions?
Okay, I think most people are here now. The Buford Monument, the inscription on it is actually behind that shrub there, so you can hardly see it on this side. The other side you could read it, but all of the individual markers are on this side, so that's why I thought I would stand over here. So I'm John Christopher Buford. If you were on the cemetery walk a year ago, you may have heard me talk about my father, Captain William Ragsdale Buford, who is buried on the other side of that next paved street over there with a number of other Buford relatives. But there wasn't enough room to put everyone there, so there's a second group over here. As I mentioned, my father was Captain William Buford. My mother, good grief, Mary Brooks Simpson Buford. Her name was Buford before I married her. The reason being, she had a previous marriage to my father's brother, Thomas Young Buford. They had 2 children together. Unfortunately, he died not too long, just a few years after they were married, leaving her with 2 very young daughters to raise. I was appointed as the administrator of my brother's estate, so I'd got to know his widow fairly well, and after a couple of years we decided to marry each other. So she became Mary Brooks Simpson Buford at that point. And we had 2 children of our own. There was another girl and myself, so I was the only boy among the 4 children. 2 half-sisters and 1 full sister. My father moved his family to San Augustine, Texas, which is near Nacogdoches. My mother's family had a large plantation there. They were fairly well-to-do, so they either lived with them for a while or near them. But my father moved his family to Hopkins County in 1857 when I was 18 years old. Okay, in 1861, the war between the states was getting underway. My father, the captain, the reason he's called the captain, organized 4 companies of men here to go fight, supporting the Confederacy, of course. And then he had another company that he was appointed the captain of. So he took his own company to Tennessee. I tried to join his company and he would not permit it. So I went to Mount Vernon and joined another company there under a Captain Leftwich. We also went to Tennessee. So both of these companies, along with quite a few others, were in the same regiment. I was involved in the Battle of Shiloh, where our commanding general, Albert Sidney Johnston, was killed, unfortunately. Not too long after that, I became seriously ill. I'd taken a manservant with me when I went to Tennessee. He brought me back here to Sulphur Springs to regain my health. And not too long after that, my father also took seriously ill, and he had to be brought back here. So neither one of us were on active duty for a long time, but we did see action while we were there. After my father was back here and on his feet again, he became a partner in a mercantile business. And they hired me to be a buyer for the mercantile business. Being a buyer in those days was not a simple matter. What I had to do to get merchandise for the store was go by horseback to Jefferson, take a boat from Jefferson to New Orleans, and take a train from New Orleans to New York, which is where most of the merchants were who were selling what we needed for the mercantile store. There were not any banks I could draw checks on in New York, so I took a satchel of money with me when I would go on these trips, which added an element of uncertainty to things, but fortunately it worked okay. So I would make 2 or 3 trips a year to get this merchandise to bring here. After a couple of years, my father decided he was tired of being in the mercantile business, so he had bought some land far at the end of Connolly Street, the west end, about 70 acres, and established a farm there. And after a couple of years, I got married. I met my wife-to-be, Elizabeth Askew, was staying with a friend of the family, Buck Thomas. The Thomases and the Bufords were friends for many years, so they had a lot of contact and intermarriages with each other. In fact, the Thomas marker is right over there, and you can see a lot of their individual headstones there also. Anyway, this girl, Elizabeth Askew, who was staying with them, and I got married. After a couple of years, we built a house on the lot where the First Baptist Church eventually was located. But that's where we raised our children. We had 10 children plus a cousin, Lizzie Askew, that we raised there. Of course, you can see that unfortunately there were several who died in infancy. That's what these smaller markers are. In fact, one of them has 2 names on it. So there must have been twins, neither one of who survived there. One of our sons, William Askew Buford, well, all the children were educated here. After he finished his basic education, he wanted to be a pharmacist. There was no place here where he could study pharmacy. So he went all the way to Greenville and spent a year sort of as an understudy, an intern with a pharmacist there, came back and started practicing pharmacy here, which was already established. Mr. Zoll, Z-O-L, Askew, and another Mr. Buford had this pharmacy business. They hired me as their pharmacist. After a couple of years, Zoll Askew died, so I became essentially the sole proprietor at that point. Although the name stayed the same, the Askew family sold their interest to me around 1920. My father had died in 1910. I practiced pharmacy there for 64 years, and I did not change the name. It stayed Askew and Buford all of that time. So those of you who've lived in this area for quite a while, I'm sure, are familiar with that name. Okay, one of the other jobs I had for a while I forgot to mention. At the end of the war, once I had regained my health, the governor of the state of Texas had commissioned me to lead wagon trains across the state to Matamoros, Mexico. The reason to do that was they were carrying cotton. They could unload cotton there on ships to avoid the Union blockade around the southern port cities. And of course, the Union did not want those shipments to go out because that would generate income for the southern states, which they were not eager to see happen. So that enterprise was successful. Oh, this son, William Askew Buford, who became the pharmacist, while he was in school here, had appeared in a school play portraying a character called Mr. Dooley, who was a witty Irishman. And the students thought that was funny, so they started calling him Dooley. And it stuck not only for the rest of his life, but on his headstone it says Dooley Buford, where he is buried close to where my father's grave is located. And he liked music a great deal. He played in the Sulphur Springs Cornet Band, and he also played in the 6th Regiment Band on the bass drum. So the Bufords were fairly actively involved in affairs around Sulphur Springs. After my father had died, his heirs sold his farm property, the 70 acres, to the city for $5,000. And at that time it was called Buford Park. And there were signs on the columns on both sides of the entrance at the end of Connolly Street. Some years later, somehow the city decided to change the name to City Park. And it operated as City Park for a number of years. But eventually, I guess there were city councilmen or maybe just civic groups who thought that was not right. The name got changed back to Buford Park again, which is what it is known as today. There are many facilities there. There were even, in fact, before it was sold to the city, churches would have events there, civic groups, Boy Scout troops. So it was already widely used, and of course the city was eager to have those things continue after they purchased the property. After Elizabeth and I had our children all out of the house and on their own, we sold that house that we had built on Gilmer and moved to Van Sickle Street, which is where we lived for the rest of our long and happy lives. Besides the properties we had here in town, I had some farming property south of town. And one of the things I liked to raise there was strawberries. And I actually have a picture here of me and my strawberry patch. It's not a real great picture, but that's me holding the box of strawberries with one of the field hands. And he doesn't show up real good, but his son is seated by his feet, and my dog is seated by my feet. Anyway, that's the strawberry patch, so I can pass this around if you'd like to. Did you get it? I'd like to take a look at it. As you can see on the marker, I died in 1920. My wife survived me for about another 20 years. She died in 1940. So we're buried side by side there. And that's where my story ends. So thank you for coming. If there are any questions, I will try to answer them. Yes, ma'am.